At my son's Christmas party, he hugged me and whispered, "Hope you're enjoying that $10,000 a month, madam." But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. I was working 2 jobs just to survive. I hadn't seen a single penny of that money. And when I told him the truth, my daughter-in-law literally started choking. Not on food, on pure raw fear. Before we go further into this crazy story, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this wild tale reaches across the country. Y'all, I'm Teresa, and at 65 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak life could throw at a person. Boy, was I wrong. Nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what went down at my son's Christmas party in Denver last December. It was like watching my entire world explode in slow motion. The party was exactly what you'd expect from Jake and his wife Samantha. Over the top, fancy, and designed to make everyone feel broke just by walking through the door. Their house looked like something straight out of those rich people magazines. Marble everywhere, chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's cars, and furniture that screamed, "Don't you dare sit on me." There I was, standing in the corner of their massive living room, wearing my best dress, a navy blue number I'd snagged on clearance 3 years ago. I felt like a fish out of water among all those designer gowns and suits that cost more than my monthly rent. My feet were absolutely killing me, and no wonder. I'd just finished an 8-hour shift at the grocery store where I work as a cashier. Before that, I'd spent the morning cleaning offices downtown. Yeah, you heard that right. At 65, I was working 2 jobs. 2 jobs. My Social Security barely covered my rent. Forget about food and medication. But hey, that's just life when you're old and poor in America, right? Jake was across the room, looking like the successful tech CEO he had become. Tall, confident, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I make in 2 months. He was laughing with some business buddies, holding a glass of whiskey that I knew cost more per bottle than I spend on groceries in a week. But here's the crazy part. I was still proud of him. Despite everything, despite how distant he had become, I was proud. This kid had worked his butt off to get where he was, and I'd sacrificed everything to make sure he could. Samantha was floating around like she owned the world. And honestly, she kind of did. Beautiful, blonde, with that kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. But every time she looked at me, there was something ice cold in those green eyes. Something that made me feel small and unwanted in my own house. I was reaching for a tiny sandwich because, let's be real, that's all I could afford to eat that day, when Jake walked over. I could tell he'd been drinking. His cheeks were flushed, and he had that swagger guys get when they've had a few too many. "Mom?" He threw his arm around my shoulders. It looked loving from the outside, but it felt calculated, like he was putting on a show. "You're looking good. Really good." "Thank you, sweetie," I said, trying to ignore how fake his smile looked. "This is a beautiful party. You and Samantha really outdid yourselves." He nodded, but his eyes had that distant look I'd gotten used to over the years, like he was playing the role of a good son instead of actually being one. And then he said something that literally changed my life forever. He continued his weird casual tone. "I'm glad you're here. Hope you're enjoying that $10,000 a month, Mom. Really living it up, I hope." Y'all. Those words hit me like a freight train. I felt all the blood drain from my face. My knees almost gave out. $10,000? What in the world was he talking about? "Honey," I whispered, barely able to get the words out over the party noise. "What $10,000? Jake's face went from casual confidence to straight-up confusion. His voice was shaking as he said, "That's impossible. I set up automatic transfers. Samantha helped me organize everything. She said you were probably too proud to mention it, but that you needed the help." And that's when everything clicked. We both turned to look at Samantha at the exact same time. She was standing by the Christmas tree, holding a piece of shrimp halfway to her mouth, but she wasn't eating. She was staring at us like she'd just seen a ghost. Our eyes met across that fancy living room, and in that split second, I saw the truth, the guilt, the panic, the desperate calculation happening behind those pretty green eyes. She knew. She knew we'd figured it out. And her face drained color faster than water down a drain. And then she started choking. But here's the kicker. It wasn't the food. It was fear. Pure, raw fear, like this horrible, gasping sound. But I could see it clear as day. It wasn't the seafood causing her distress. It was the realization that her perfect little scam was crashing down around her ears. Jake rushed over, patting her back, asking if she was okay, but Samantha's eyes never left mine. And in those eyes, I saw 3 years of lies, 3 years of stolen money, 3 years of watching me struggle while she lived like a queen on what should have been my lifeline. The room was spinning. People were starting to notice something was wrong. Someone asked if they should call 911, but all I could think about was the mortgage payment I'd missed last month, the prescription I couldn't afford to fill, the nights I'd gone to bed hungry because I had to choose between rent and food. The money, I whispered to Jake while he was still trying to help his choking wife. He looked up at me, and his face was this mixture of confusion and growing horror. He said, "To your account, the one Samantha set up for you. She said it would be easier to manage, that you were getting older and might have trouble keeping track of your finances." Did y'all catch that? She told him I was getting senile, that I couldn't handle my own money. This woman had convinced my son that his own mother was losing her mind. Samantha had stopped choking by then, but she was still gasping and staring at me with those terrified eyes. She knew I knew, and she knew her perfect little world was about to crash down around her. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. Not anger yet, that would come later. Just this terrible, crystal clear understanding of how completely I'd been betrayed by the two people who should have protected me most. The party kept going around us, but everything had changed. The laughter sounded hollow, the light seemed dimmer, and I realized that this beautiful house, this lavish lifestyle, this perfect Christmas celebration, it had all been built, at least partly, on money that was meant to keep me from working myself to death at 65. But here's what really got me. As I watched Samantha try to pull herself together, straightening her expensive dress and trying to look normal, I saw something I'd never seen before. She was terrified of me. And for the first time in 3 years of struggle and pain, I felt something other than exhaustion. I felt power. But to understand how we got here, I'm going to take you back, way back. Because this story, it doesn't start with Samantha's betrayal. It starts with love. The kind of love that makes a mother sacrifice everything for her child. I was 32 when my husband David died. Heart attack at 35. No warning, no time to say goodbye. One minute he was laughing at Jake's silly 5-year-old jokes over breakfast. The next minute, he was gone. Just gone. Leaving me with a kindergartner and a mountain of medical debt that insurance barely touched. Those first months after David's death were the hardest of my entire life. Jake would wake up crying for his daddy every single night, and I'd hold him in our tiny apartment in Phoenix, both of us drowning in grief. I remember one night in particular when he looked up at me with those big brown eyes, the same eyes that now looked at me with such distance, and asked when Daddy was coming home. "Daddy's not coming home, baby," I whispered, my own tears falling onto his little head. "But Mommy's here. Mommy will always be here." And I was. God help me, I was there for everything. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. I cleaned offices before dawn, worked at a diner during the day, and took in sewing at night after Jake went to bed. My fingers were constantly pricked and swollen from needlework. My back ached from all the cleaning. I lived on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, but Jake never knew we were struggling. I made sure of that. When he wanted to join Little League, I sold my wedding ring to pay for the equipment and fees. When he needed new school clothes, I wore the same 3 outfits for 2 years straight so he could have what the other kids had. When he got sick, I worked double shifts to pay for doctor visits because health insurance, yeah, that was a luxury we couldn't afford. I remember this one night when Jake came home from school all excited about a field trip to the Science Museum in Tucson. The permission slip needed a $25 fee. $25. I looked at that piece of paper and felt my heart shatter. I had $12 to my name, and rent was due in 3 days. That night, after Jake fell asleep, I walked 6 blocks to the pawn shop and sold my mother's necklace, the only piece of jewelry I had left from my family. The guy gave me $30 for something that was probably worth 10 times that much. But I didn't argue. Jake went on that field trip, and he never knew what it cost me. High school was even tougher. Jake was smart, brilliant actually, but he wanted to take advanced classes that needed expensive textbooks and lab fees. He wanted to join debate team, computer club, academic decathlon. Every single activity meant more money I didn't have, more sacrifices I made gladly. I took out loans I couldn't afford to buy him a decent computer when he showed interest in programming. I worked Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve every year for the overtime pay so he could have the calculator he needed for advanced math, the chemistry set he wanted for his birthday, the clothes that would help him fit in. College nearly killed me. Literally. Jake got into a great university in California with a partial scholarship, but I still needed to come up with $30,000 a year for room, board, and everything the scholarship didn't cover. I took out a second mortgage on our tiny house, the one I'd finally managed to buy after years of renting, and worked every hour God gave me. I aged 10 years in those 4 years. My hair went completely gray. My arthritis started from all the physical labor. I developed high blood pressure from the constant stress. But every time Jake called home to tell me about his grades, his internships, his big plans for the future, it felt worth it. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every missed meal, it all felt worth it. He graduated with highest honors with a computer science degree and immediately got a job at a tech startup that would eventually make him a millionaire. I cried during his graduation ceremony, not just because he'd succeeded, but because all those years of sacrifice had finally paid off. But something changed after graduation, something I didn't see coming. Jake moved to Denver for his job, and our phone calls became less frequent. He was busy, he said, important meetings, big projects, networking events. I got it. He was building his career, just like I'd always wanted. Then he met Samantha. I knew from the moment I met her that she didn't like me. It wasn't anything she said directly. Samantha was too smooth for that. It was the way she looked at my worn-out clothes, my rough hands, my small house with its secondhand furniture. I could see her calculating my worth and finding me seriously lacking. She started subtly keeping Jake away from me. Suddenly, every time he planned to visit, there was a work emergency or some social thing that Samantha thought was more important. When I called, she'd answer with this cool politeness that made it crystal clear I was interrupting something way more significant. "Jake's in a meeting," she'd say, or "He's really swamped with work right now, Teresa. Maybe try calling next week." Gradually, the call stopped altogether. Birthday cards became our only communication. Jake would send expensive gifts, things I couldn't use or afford to maintain, like silk scarves or fancy electronics I didn't understand. But he stopped asking how I was doing or if I needed anything. I told myself it was normal. Sons grow up, move on, start their own families. I'd done my job raising him, and now he was living his own life. The loneliness was just part of being an older woman whose kid had become successful. But standing in their mansion that night, looking at those crystal chandeliers and marble floors, calculating how much their furniture cost compared to my monthly income, I realized something that made my chest tighten with pain I'd never felt before. All those years of sacrifice, all those nights I went hungry so he could eat, all the times I worked myself to the bone so he could have opportunities, none of it had taught him the value of taking care of family. Samantha had convinced him that I was somehow beneath them, that my struggles were my own fault, that helping me was charity instead of love. And while I'd been working 2 jobs at 65, cleaning toilets and standing on my feet for 14 hours a day, they'd been living in luxury, thinking I was getting money I never saw. Hold up, before we continue, I need to know something. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely? Someone who is supposed to have your back? Drop a comment and let me know, because what happens next is gonna blow your mind. The days after that Christmas party were a blur of uncomfortable silence and difficult conversations. Jake insisted on driving me home that night, his face pale as we sat in his expensive car outside my tiny duplex in a not-so-great part of town. He kept apologizing, his voice shaken with confusion and what I hoped was real guilt. I nodded, too emotionally wiped out to say much. "I believe you, honey, but we need to figure out what happened to it." 3 days later, Jake called and asked if he could come over. His voice was different, harder, angrier than I'd heard it in years. When he showed up at my door, he looked like he hadn't slept since the party. His usually perfect hair was a mess. His clothes were wrinkled, and there was something in his eyes that reminded me of the little boy who used to run to me when he was hurt. "We need to talk," he said, settling onto my worn-out couch with this thick folder of papers. "I've been doing some digging." I poured us both coffee in my mismatched mugs, the only ones I had left after selling most of my good dishes last year to pay for a car repair. Jake spread those papers across my coffee table, pointing to bank statements and transfer records with a shaking finger. "Here," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "This is the account I've been sending money to for 3 years. Look at the name on it." I leaned forward, squinting at the tiny print. The account was in my name, all right. Teresa Elizabeth Thompson. But something was off about the address. Instead of my duplex on Oak Street, it listed an address I'd never seen before in my life. "That's not my address," I said slowly. "I've never seen this account before in my life." Jake's jaw clenched so hard, I thought he might crack a tooth. "The address belongs to a mailbox rental place downtown. Samantha's been intercepting all the statements. She told me she was helping you manage your finances because you were getting older and might have trouble keeping track of things." Those words hit me like a slap across the face. She told him I was getting senile. Not in those exact words, but close enough. "God, Mom, I'm so stupid," Jake said, running his hands through his hair. "She made it sound like she was protecting you. She said you were too proud and might be embarrassed about needing help, so it was better if I handled everything through her." I stared at those bank statements, watching the numbers blur as tears filled my eyes. Month after month, $10,000 had been deposited into this fake account. But the withdrawal patterns told a completely different story. The money wasn't being saved or carefully managed. It was being spent, often within days of each deposit. "What has she been spending it on?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Jake pulled out another set of papers, credit card statements and receipts he apparently gathered from their house. Spa treatments, designer clothes, girls' trips to Napa Valley with her friends, that expensive gym membership she just had to have, the personal trainer, weekly manicures, shopping sprees. As he read off the list, I felt this strange numbness settle over me. While I'd been skipping meals to afford my arthritis medication, Samantha had been getting $100 facials. While I'd been wearing the same winter coat for 8 years, she'd been buying designer purses. While I'd been lying awake worrying about money, she'd been living off my son's generosity meant for me. "There's more," Jake said quietly, and something in his tone made my stomach drop. I found emails, messages between Samantha and her sister, her friends. She's been bragging about it." He handed me printed copies of email exchanges, and as I read them, I felt something cold and hard form in my chest. "You should see how easy it is to manage Jake's guilt about his mother," one email read. "I just mention how she's struggling, and he immediately wants to throw money at the problem. Of course, I make sure the money goes where it's actually needed, maintaining our lifestyle. His mother is surviving fine on her own. She's tougher than he thinks." Another email was even worse. "The old woman actually thinks Jake doesn't care about her anymore. It's perfect. She's too proud to ask for help directly, and Jake feels like he's doing his duty by sending money. Meanwhile, I get to enjoy the benefits without having to deal with a needy mother-in-law constantly asking for handouts." But the email that absolutely broke my heart was sent just 2 weeks before the Christmas party. "Jake keeps talking about having his mother over for Christmas. I can't stand the thought of her in my house, judging everything, making Jake feel guilty about our success. Maybe it's time to phase out the money transfers. She's managed this long without them. She obviously doesn't really need the help." I set those papers down with shaking hands. Jake was watching me carefully, his face showing rage and guilt, and something that might have been fear. "Mom," he said softly, "I am so sorry. I trusted her completely. I thought I was taking care of you." I looked around my small living room at the furniture I'd bought secondhand 20 years ago, the carpet worn thin from youth, the windows that needed replacing but that I couldn't afford to fix. Then I thought about Samantha's mansion with its marble countertops and crystal chandeliers and rooms bigger than my entire house. "Where is she now?" I asked. "At her sister's in Boulder. She left right after the party, said she needed time to think. She hasn't been answering my calls." Of course she'd run. She knew exactly what she had done, and she knew she'd been caught red-handed. The question was what she planned to do next. Try to deny everything, somehow blame me, or attempt to manipulate Jake into forgiving her. "Jake, I need you to understand something," I said carefully.
This isn't just about the money. He frowned. What do you mean? She didn't just steal from me. She stole 3 years of your love, your concern, your care. You thought you were helping me, so you didn't worry about whether I was okay. You didn't call because you figured the money was enough. She made sure I felt abandoned by my own son while she enjoyed the benefits of your generosity. Jake's face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy who used to cry in my arms after his father died. I abandoned you, he whispered. I let her convince me that sending money was the same as caring. You didn't know, I said. But even as I spoke the words, I felt the weight of all those lonely years, all those nights I'd wondered why my son never called, never visited, never seemed to care whether I was struggling. I should have known, Jake said fiercely. I should have visited more, called more, paid attention. I should have seen that you were working yourself to death while my wife was living in luxury.
I need time to think, I said finally, about what I want, about what's fair, about what comes next. Jake nodded, gathering up the papers. Of course, take all the time you need. And Mom, I'm going to make this right, I promise. After he left, I sat alone in my small living room, surrounded by evidence of Samantha's lies. But I wasn't thinking about the money anymore, or even about the betrayal. I was thinking about power and how completely I'd given mine away without even realizing it. For the first time in years, I was thinking about what I wanted instead of what everyone else needed from me. And what I wanted was something Samantha had never considered possible. I wanted to win. 2 weeks had passed since Jake's revelation about that fake bank account, and I'd been doing my own investigating. At 67, I might not understand computers the way my son did, but I understood people, and I understood records. Years of managing household finances on nothing had taught me to pay attention to details others might miss. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, surrounded by papers I'd requested from the bank, when my phone rang. Jake's number flashed on the screen, and something in the way it rang told me this wasn't going to be pleasant. Mom, his voice was strained, exhausted. We need to talk. Can I come over? Of course, sweetheart. 20 minutes later, Jake stood at my door looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His face was worn down, his clothes rumpled, and there was this defeated quality that reminded me of the day his father died. Behind him stood a woman I didn't recognize, middle-aged, professional-looking, carrying a briefcase. Mom, this is Rebecca Martinez. She's a forensic accountant. I hired her to dig deeper into Samantha's finances. Jake's voice was flat, emotionless. What she found? It's worse than we thought. Rebecca shook my hand with a firm grip, her expression sympathetic but businesslike. Mrs. Thompson, may we sit down? What I need to share with you is pretty extensive. We settled around my small dining table, and Rebecca opened her briefcase, pulling out folders thick with documents. Mrs. Thompson, when your son first contacted me, I thought we were dealing with simple financial deception, a wife intercepting money meant for her mother-in-law. But this goes much, much deeper. She spread out bank statements, credit reports, and what looked like legal documents. Your daughter-in-law didn't just steal the money your son was sending you, Mrs. Thompson. She's been systematically manipulating your son's entire financial picture for years. Jake leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. Mom, she's been lying about everything. The house, the cars, the lifestyle. It's all been funded by money she claimed was being spent on various family needs, including money she said was for you. I don't understand, though cold dread was settling in my stomach. Rebecca pointed to a series of transactions on one of the statements. Your son has been incredibly generous over the years, Mrs. Thompson. Not just the $10,000 a month that was supposed to go to you, but additional money for what Samantha claimed were your medical emergencies, home repairs, car troubles, crisis after crisis that required immediate financial help. I felt the blood drain from my face. What medical emergencies? What home repairs? Exactly, Rebecca said grimly. In the past 3 years alone, Samantha claimed you needed $47,000 for various emergencies: a roof replacement after storm damage that supposedly destroyed your house, emergency surgery that your insurance didn't cover, a car accident that left you unable to work for months. Jake's voice was barely a whisper. Mom, I thought I was helping you through crisis after crisis. Every time I start to worry about visiting you or wonder why you never called to thank me, Samantha would tell me you were too proud, too embarrassed about needing help. She told me you specifically asked that I not visit during these difficult times. Rebecca continued, reading from what appeared to be printed emails. That you were depressed about your financial situation and didn't want your son to see you struggling. I stared at the papers, trying to process the magnitude of what I was hearing. Not only had Samantha stolen the monthly support Jake thought he was providing, but she'd invented emergencies, created fictional crises, all to get even more money while making sure Jake stayed away from me. How much? I asked quietly. Rebecca consulted her notes. Including the monthly payments and the emergency funds, approximately $230,000 over 3 years. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. $230,000. More money than I'd earned in the last 6 years combined. Money that could have let me retire, live comfortably, stop working 2 jobs at the age when I should have been enjoying my golden years. But there's more, Rebecca said, and I wasn't sure I could handle any more revelations. Mrs. Thompson, are you familiar with your late husband's family property, the land his grandfather left him? I frowned. You mean that old property up in the mountains? David inherited it from his grandfather, but we never did anything with it. It was just wild land, trees, and a creek. After David died, I couldn't afford to pay the property taxes, so I assumed it had been sold for taxes years ago. Jake and Rebecca exchanged a look that made my stomach clench. Mrs. Thompson, Rebecca said carefully, that property was never sold for taxes. Your daughter-in-law has been paying the taxes on it for 3 years. She also commissioned a land survey and an environmental assessment. Why would she do that? I asked, though something deep in my gut already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Because the state is planning a new highway expansion, and that property is directly in the path of development. The government will be forced to purchase it through eminent domain, and the compensation estimate is between $1.2 and $1.8 million. The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of the table trying to process what I was hearing. Are you telling me that land is worth over $1 million? Yes, ma'am. And legally, as your late husband's widow, you're the rightful owner. But Samantha has been positioning herself to claim ownership by virtue of paying the taxes and maintaining the property. Jake's face was white as paper. She's been planning this for years, Mom. The whole time she was stealing from you, making you struggle, keeping me away from you, she was positioning herself to steal your inheritance too. I thought about all the times I'd wondered what had happened to that old property, all the times I felt guilty about letting it go. David loved that land. His grandfather had cleared it by hand, built a small cabin there that had long since fallen down. I'd always meant to visit it,
to see if there was anything worth saving, but I never had the time or money for such a trip.
She's been going there, Rebecca continued, maintaining the access road, clearing brush, even having the old foundation surveyed. She's created a paper trail that suggests she's been the property's caretaker for years. Can she really steal it from me? I asked. Not if we act quickly, Rebecca said. But she's been clever about creating documentation that could support a claim of adverse possession. If this had gone on much longer, she might have been able to make a legal case for ownership. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Samantha's deception. This wasn't just about stealing money or manipulating my relationship with my son. She had been systematically planning to steal my husband's legacy, the one thing of real value he'd left behind. There's one more thing, Rebecca said, and her voice was even more careful now. Mrs. Thompson, we found evidence that Samantha has been researching your health insurance, your medical history, your life expectancy. Jake made a sound like he'd been punched. What kind of research? The kind someone does when they're planning for future inheritance issues, Rebecca said delicately. The implication hit me like ice water. Samantha hadn't just been stealing from me and planning to steal my property. She had been calculating how much longer I might live, planning for what she could claim after I was gone. I looked at my son, this successful man who thought he was taking care of his mother while his wife systematically destroyed me. His face was twisted with grief and rage and something that looked like horror at his own blindness. Jake, I said quietly, I need you to understand something. This isn't your fault. He started to protest, but I held up my hand. Your wife is a predator. She identified you as someone with money and a generous heart, and she exploited that. She identified me as someone with assets and few protections, and she exploited that too. This was a long-term plan executed with incredible patience and cunning. But I should have seen it, Jake said, his voice breaking. I should have visited more, called more, paid attention to what was really happening with you. Yes, I said simply, you should have. But that doesn't make you responsible for her crimes. We sat in silence for a moment, all of us processing the enormity of what Samantha had done. Finally, Rebecca spoke. Mrs. Thompson, what would you like to do with this information? We have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges, civil recovery, and to secure your legal claim to the property. But these decisions are ultimately yours to make. I looked at the papers spread across my table, evidence of the most comprehensive betrayal I could have imagined. Then I looked at my son, who was watching me with desperate hope and terrible guilt. I need time to think, I said. But Rebecca, I want you to do whatever is necessary to secure my legal claim to that property immediately, today if possible. Of course. After they left, I walked through my small house, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just my humble home anymore. It was evidence of how successfully I'd been victimized. Every worn piece of furniture, every outdated appliance, every sign of my years of struggle stood as proof of Samantha's cruelty. But I was done being a victim. For the first time in years, I had power, and I intended to use it. 3 days after Rebecca's devastating revelations, Jake called me early in the morning. His voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. Mom, Samantha's back. She wants to meet with all of us. She says she can explain everything. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd learned the scope of my daughter-in-law's betrayal, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. In front of me were the legal documents Rebecca had rushed through, official papers confirming my ownership of David's family property, along with a preliminary estimate of its value.
$1.6 million. I asked, where does she want to meet? She says it's her home too, and she has a right to discuss this on familiar ground. Of course she did. Even in defeat, Samantha wanted the advantage of her territory, surrounded by the luxury she had purchased with stolen money. But I was done letting other people control the terms of my life. No, I said firmly. If she wants to talk, we meet at Rebecca's office with lawyers present. This isn't a family discussion anymore. This is a legal matter. Jake was quiet for a moment. He's not going to like that. I don't care what she likes. 2 hours later, I sat in Rebecca's conference room, wearing my best dress, the same navy blue one I'd worn to the Christmas party. But somehow it felt different on me now. More like armor than apology. Jake sat beside me, his lawyer on his other side. Across the polished table sat Samantha and her attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone. Samantha looked terrible. Her usually perfect blonde hair was unkempt. Her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her designer clothes seemed to hang on her like costume pieces on the wrong actor. But when our eyes met across the table, I saw that the calculation was still there, the sense that she was working an angle even now. "Teresa," she began, her voice soft and apologetic, "I know how this must look, but I need you to understand that everything I did was with the best intentions." Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her pen poised on a legal pad. "Mrs. Martinez, I should inform you that this conversation is being recorded with everyone's consent, as indicated by the signed agreements." Her attorney nodded curtly. Samantha herself seemed to hesitate for just a moment before continuing. "I was trying to protect Jake from feeling guilty," she said, her eyes focused on me with what might have been genuine pleading. "You're so independent, so proud. Every time he wanted to help you, you'd refuse. I thought if I managed the financial support discreetly, you could maintain your dignity while still getting the help you needed." I kept my expression neutral, but inside I felt familiar anger building. Even caught red-handed, she was still trying to manipulate the narrative. "And the property taxes?" Rebecca asked mildly. "Were you paying those to protect Mrs. Thompson's dignity as well?" Samantha's composure slipped slightly. "I was protecting a family asset. Jake is David's stepson, and when Teresa passes away, that property would naturally—" "I'm not David's stepson," Jake said sharply. "David adopted me legally when I was 7. That makes me his son, not his stepson. And that property belongs to my mother, not to us." She turned to him with that desperate look I'd seen her use before when she needed to regain control. "Honey, you're upset, and I understand that, but we need to think practically about the future. Your mother isn't getting any younger, and that property is going to require significant management when the state begins the acquisition process."
"Management that you were planning to provide?" Rebecca asked. "For a substantial fee, I assume." Samantha's lawyer placed a hand on her arm, but she ignored him. "I was trying to ensure that Jake's inheritance would be properly handled. Teresa doesn't understand complex financial transactions." That was when something inside me snapped, not into anger, but into perfect, crystal clear certainty. "Samantha," I said quietly, and my voice carried a calm authority that surprised even me, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." She turned to me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely uncertain. "I've spent the last 3 days thinking about everything you've done. The stolen money, the fake emergencies, the lies you told my son to keep him away from me, the way you've been planning to steal my husband's legacy." I paused, letting the words settle in the room. "But mostly, I've been thinking about how you made me feel for 3 years.
how you made me believe that my own son didn't care about me, how you turned his love and generosity into weapons against both of us. Samantha's face was pale, but she was still trying to maintain that manipulative earnestness. Teresa, I never meant for you to feel. You meant exactly that. You wanted me to feel abandoned and forgotten. You wanted Jake to feel like he was doing his duty without actually having to connect with me. You orchestrated our separation because it served your purposes. I stood up, Rebecca's documents in my hands. Jake, I said, turning to my son, you've offered to make this right, to give me back the stolen money, to leave your wife and start over. Jake nodded eagerly. Yes, Mom, whatever you want. I don't want your money, I said, and I saw the shock on his face. I don't want you to leave your wife for me. I don't want you to upend your life to fix what she broke. Samantha's expression shifted to something that might have been hope, but I wasn't finished. I want something else entirely. I want you to make a choice, Jake. A real choice, based on who you want to be and what kind of life you want to live. I placed the property documents on the table in front of me. I'm going to be a wealthy woman very soon. This property that your wife tried to steal from me is worth more than $1.5 million. I don't need your money anymore, and I don't need your guilt. Jake's face was a mixture of confusion and hope. What do you need, Mom? I need for you to decide whether you want a relationship with me based on love and respect, or whether you want to continue living in a marriage built on lies and manipulation. I looked directly at Samantha, whose face had gone completely white. Because here's what's going to happen. I'm going to sell that property and use the money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I'm going to quit both my jobs and move somewhere beautiful, somewhere I can finally rest. I gathered up my purse and stood to leave. And Samantha, I'm going to make sure that everyone, your friends, your family, your social circle, knows exactly what kind of person you are, not through some public campaign, but through careful, truthful conversations with people who matter to you. Samantha's lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, but Samantha herself looked like she might faint. But I'm not going to press criminal charges, and I'm not going to sue you for the money you stole. Do you know why? She shook her head mutely. Because the best revenge isn't destroying you. It's succeeding without you. It's living well while you live with the knowledge of what you've done. I turned back to Jake one last time. Son, if you want a relationship with me, it has to be real. No more money transfers, no more guilt-driven gestures, just genuine care and respect between a mother and son who choose to be in each other's lives. Jake stood up, his eyes bright with tears. I want that more than anything, Mom. Then you know what you need to do. I walked out of that conference room feeling lighter than I had in years. Behind me, I could hear Samantha's voice, high and desperate, trying to convince Jake that I was being unreasonable, that she could change, that their marriage was worth saving. But I didn't turn around to see what he would choose. For the first time in my adult life, I was walking towards my own future instead of trying to fix someone else's problems. And it felt like freedom. Now, here's what I want to know from you, and be honest in the comments. If someone you trusted completely betrayed you like this, could you find it in your heart to forgive them? Or would you want revenge? Drop your thoughts below, because this story isn't over yet. 18 months later, I was sitting on the wraparound porch of my new house in Asheville, North Carolina, watching the morning mist rise from the Blue Ridge Mountains. The house wasn't enormous. I'd learned that happiness doesn't come from square footage, but it was mine, paid for in full with money from David's family property. Every morning, I sat in the same spot with my coffee, marveling at the peace that comes from a life lived on your own terms. The phone buzzed on the table beside me, a text from Jake. We'd developed a routine over the past year, communicating regularly but naturally, without the forced guilt or obligation that had characterized our relationship for so long. "Good morning, Mom. Hope you're enjoying the beautiful weather. Sarah and I are driving down this weekend if you're free for dinner. Sarah, Jake's new girlfriend, a kind woman who worked as a nurse and treated me like a person rather than an obligation. The first time Jake brought her to visit, I'd watched her carefully, looking for signs of the same manipulative charm that had fooled my son before. Instead, I'd found a woman who listened when I talked, who asked about my life with genuine interest, who helped with dishes not because she was performing the role of a good daughter-in-law, but because that's who she was. I texted back, "I'd love that. I'll make my famous pot roast." It had taken Jake 6 months to leave Samantha after that meeting in Rebecca's office. 6 months of trying to salvage something from a marriage built on lies and manipulation, of couples therapy sessions where Samantha alternated between tearful apologies and angry accusations.
I'd stayed out of it completely, focusing on my own life for the first time in decades. When Jake finally called to tell me he'd filed for divorce, his voice had been exhausted but relieved. "She fought me on everything, Mom. The house, the cars. She even tried to claim she deserved part of your property settlement because she'd managed the family finances for years." Samantha had gotten nothing in the divorce except what the law required, half of the assets that were genuinely Jake's, none of the money she'd stolen from me, and certainly none of my property settlement. Her lawyer had tried to argue that she deserved compensation for the care management she'd provided, but Rebecca had dismantled that argument with cold efficiency. The last I'd heard, Samantha was living in a small apartment in a not-so-great part of Denver, working as a receptionist at a dental office. Not the dramatic downfall some people might have wanted, but a quiet reduction to the kind of ordinary life she'd always looked down on. Jake occasionally mentioned seeing her around town, looking older and harder, but they never spoke. I'd kept my promise about not pressing criminal charges, but I'd also kept my promise about making sure people knew who she really was. Not through any dramatic confrontation or public shaming, but through the kind of careful, truthful conversations that matter in a community. When her friends asked why Jake had left her, I simply told them the truth when asked. When people wondered why she'd moved out of the mansion, I explained about the stolen money and forged documents. The truth, it turned out, was more powerful than any revenge I could have planned. My neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, emerged from her house next door, waving as she headed to her garden. She was 84, a widow like me, and over the past year, she'd become the kind of friend I'd never had time for when I was working 2 jobs and worrying about money. We shared recipes, watched old movies together, and sometimes just sat on our respective porches in comfortable silence. "Morning, Teresa. Coffee smells especially good today, doesn't it?" "Perfect weather for it," I called back, and marveled again at how such simple pleasures had become precious to me. I'd quit both my jobs the day the property sale was finalized. Walking out of that grocery store for the last time, hanging up my cashier's vest, had felt like shedding skin I'd outgrown years ago. The cleaning job had even been easier to leave. I'd simply called the company and told them I was retiring. Retirement. At 67, I was finally doing what most people did in their 60s. Enjoying the fruits of a lifetime of work, spending time on hobbies and relationships instead of survival. I'd taken up painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. My small studio was set up in what had been intended as a formal dining room, easel positioned to catch the mountain light.
I wasn't particularly good at it, but that wasn't the point. The point was having time to be bad at something new, time to improve slowly, time to create something just for the joy of creation. My phone rang, interrupting my peaceful morning thoughts. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen. "Good morning, Rebecca. Please tell me this isn't about legal problems." Her laugh was warm. "Nothing like that, Teresa. I'm calling with good news. Remember that class action lawsuit against the financial management company that Samantha used to hide your money?" "Of course. They've agreed to settle. The amount isn't huge, about $12,000 for you, but it's something. More importantly, the company has agreed to implement new safeguards to prevent this kind of fraud in the future." $12,000 wouldn't change my life, but knowing that other families might be protected from what I experienced felt like a victory of a different sort. "That's wonderful news," I said. "There's something else," Rebecca continued. "I've been contacted by a legal aid organization. They're seeing more cases like yours. Adult children's spouses manipulating financial families, isolating elderly parents, that sort of thing. They'd like to talk to you about sharing your story, maybe helping develop resources for other families." I considered this carefully. A year ago, the thought of making my private pain public would have terrified me. But now, with the security of financial independence and the clarity that comes from having survived betrayal, it felt like an opportunity to transform my experience into something useful. "I'd be interested in hearing more about that," I said. After Rebecca hung up, I remained on my porch, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this place. The betrayal that had devastated me had ultimately freed me. The son I thought I'd lost had found his way back to me, not through guilt or obligation, but through genuine choice. The money I'd never known I had given me not just financial security, but the power to shape my own life. Jake's car pulled into my driveway just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. He got out alone. Sarah must have stayed behind to handle some work obligations and walked toward me with the easy stride of a man who'd shed a significant burden. "Morning, Mom," he said, settling into the chair beside mine. "Sarah sends her apologies. She got called in for an emergency at the hospital, but promises to make it up to you next weekend." "She doesn't need to make up anything," I said. "I like that she takes her job seriously." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us looking out at the mountains. Finally, Jake spoke. "I've been thinking about Dad lately, about what he would have thought of all this." I smiled. "He would have been proud of how you handled it once you understood what was happening. And he would have loved knowing that his grandfather's land finally provided for his family the way the old man always hoped it would." "Do you think he would have seen through Samantha sooner than I did?" It was a question Jake had asked in various forms over the past year, and I understood the guilt that drove it. But I'd also learned something about forgiveness. Not the kind you give to others, but the kind you give to yourself. "Your father was a good man, but he wasn't magic, sweetheart. Smart people get fooled by manipulative people every day. The important thing is that you figured it out eventually and made the right choice." Jake nodded, but I could see he was still carrying some of that weight. "Jake," I said, "I need you to understand something. What happened with Samantha wasn't your fault, but more importantly, it wasn't a waste. Those 3 years of separation, of misunderstanding, they taught us both something valuable." He turned to look at me. "What's that?" They taught us that our relationship can't be based on duty or guilt or obligation. It has to be based on choice. Every conversation we have now, every visit, every text message, it's because we want to be in each other's lives, not because we feel we have to be. Jake's eyes were bright with tears. I do want to be in your life, Mom. Not because I feel guilty about the past, but because I genuinely like the person you are. I like sitting here talking with you. I like hearing about your painting classes and your neighbor friends. I like that you're finally living the life you deserve. And I like the man you've become, not the successful businessman, though I'm proud of that too. I like the person who was brave enough to leave a marriage that was killing his soul. I like the person who chose honesty over comfort. We sat quietly for a while longer, and I thought about the strange mathematics of loss and gain. I'd lost 3 years of my son's presence, a significant amount of money, and the illusion that family loyalty was automatic. But I'd gained financial independence, genuine peace, and a relationship with Jake that was deeper and more honest than anything we'd had before. As the morning sun climbed higher over the mountains, I felt the kind of contentment I'd never experienced before. Not the desperate gratitude of someone who'd been given unexpected kindness, but the solid satisfaction of someone who fought for what they deserved and won. I was 67 years old, financially secure, surrounded by people who chose to love me rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate me. I had time to paint badly, time to drink coffee slowly, time to watch the seasons change from my own front porch. It had taken me nearly 7 decades to learn that the best revenge against those who try to diminish you isn't destruction or punishment. It's living so well that their betrayal becomes irrelevant. And for the first time in my life, I was doing exactly that. Now, I'm curious about you who've listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below and let me know. And meanwhile, I'm putting 2 other incredible stories on your screen right now. Stories from this channel that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't want to miss them. Thanks for sticking with me until the end. It means the world to me.